AJ just mentioned climate change, and this summer was in fact the hottest on record, according to climate scientists. European countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece saw July temperatures of more than 45 degrees Celsius, and wildfires ripped through southern parts of the continent. Across the continent, average temperatures were 0.83 degrees above average. Now, Paris has come up with measures to deal with the heat, and it's hoped the plans will help the French capital become climate neutral by 2050.
Paris, the city of love, has long been a tourist's dream. But on hot summer days, it can feel hard to breathe. Concrete roads and buildings turn the French capital into an urban heat island. That's why Paris is investing tens of millions of euros to help cool down the city.
Paris is a very dense city that soaks up the heat during the day and releases it at night. We will replace concrete with green stretches, and we will insulate public buildings.
Many squares have already gone green, like the Place de la Nation in eastern Paris. This roundabout in the south of the city is being transformed into an urban forest, as trees cool down the air by several degrees. Greenery is also being planted on schoolyards and the streets in front of schools. The River Seine is equally helping to cool down the city. It's connected to a network of underground water pipes linked to over 700 buildings across the city, called Fraîcheur de Paris. This is one of the system's main plans, the Centrale Canada.
These pumps push ice-cold water through the system. The water is cooled by refrigeration units, which heat up in the process. That heat will be dissipated into the Seine. Its water flows through a secondary circuit. This system consumes half as much electricity as a conventional air conditioning unit.
And that electricity comes entirely from renewable energy. Today, the network has 90 kilometers of pipes. The company plans to triple that over the next 2 decades. Fraîcheur de Paris is already helping to cool places like the Louvre Museum and Paris Town Hall. But air conditioning systems that use river water can't be endlessly extended, says this expert on urban climate adaptation.
Systems like Fraîcheur de Paris warm up the river water, and that's only safe up to a certain threshold to protect the local biodiversity. So these systems can't cool down an entire city. We have to choose the buildings we connect to them.
Outside, the city of Paris is setting up new roofs to provide shade, like this one in a lower-income neighborhood in northern Paris. We carried out a little test just a few minutes ago, and it's about 6 degrees Celsius cooler under this roof than it is under the sun. Sometimes the temperature difference is even 10 degrees.
We are installing 24 roofs like this across Paris, on top of our existing heat measures. Our heat plan includes, for example, regularly checking in on vulnerable people and offering spaces, such as in town halls, where they can cool off.
Measures like these will become even more important in the future. Some experts fear Paris will have to deal with up to 50 degrees Celsius one day.
Jake Biddle is a staff writer at the online magazine Grist, focused on solutions at the intersection of climate and justice. His book, The Great Displacement, examines the story of climate migration in the United States. It was published earlier this year. Welcome to DW, Jake. Now, what are some of the best ways you can think of to make cities ready for climate change?
Yeah, so it really depends on what disaster you're talking about. With heat, like Paris is dealing with, there's an incredibly intensive process of putting shade and green space in, hundreds or thousands of acres, which can take, as is the case in Paris, a really, really long time. Then when you have these bigger disasters like wildfires or flooding, the cities really have two options. They can build up by making their homes, harder and building seawalls, or they can just try to get out of the way, right? Which some cities have done. They move back from the water, or they try to get out of the places that are most vulnerable to fire. But it really does depend on what the specific vulnerability of a city is.
Yeah. Let's go into your field of expertise. You've done extensive research about climate migration, and whenever we talk about that, we often paint it as a part of a dystopian future, don't we? But people are being displaced by climate change already as we're speaking, and you talked to some of them. What did they tell you?
Yeah, so I think that climate migration in the present tense looks probably a little bit different than we would imagine it, right? It's not a bunch of people moving across, national borders or across continents over long distances. It's a lot of internal displacement, right? So in a place like Pakistan, after the recent floods, you had millions of people who they were internally displaced. They went to big cities, and that's been the case in the United States too. After hurricanes and wildfires, you'll see people, they bounce around apartments, or they go to live with their family, or they move back and then they can't afford it. It's just really, really chaotic and really hard to predict. So in the book, I use the word displacement over migration to try to capture some of that chaos and the sort of churning nature of the process.
Who would you say is most at risk of climate change related displacement?
Yeah, so I think in the U.S. and in other countries, the people who are most at risk of being displaced are the people who don't have traditional equity or access to finance, right? So if you rent a house, right, and you don't have equity in your home, then you probably won't get a big insurance payout that allows you to rebuild. If you don't have access to credit to begin with, then you certainly won't be able to get the money to get back on your feet if a flood, destroys your town, or if you lose your job as a result of it. So what I saw kind of over and over again in the United States is that if a wildfire hit a city, it was always the people with, the least access to sort of traditional forms of housing, people who were experiencing homelessness or who were renting an apartment, living paycheck to paycheck. Those people always ended up sort of suffering a very different fate from people who got a big insurance payout on their home and were able to rebuild right where they were before.
Yeah. Because of all this, you're predicting that over the next 50 years, we'll see the largest migration in U.S. history. What's being done to prepare for that, in terms of mitigation, adaptation, but also preparation?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, in the United States, we've made just some amount of progress on the mitigation of carbon emissions over the past few years. I mean, certainly the number is still going up, but we put a lot of money into clean energy. But in terms of adaptation and preparing for internal displacement, I mean, I wrote that, very little is being done. The federal government has tried to fund some experimental programs to move a whole town or to buy people out of vulnerable areas. But we're really sort of still in the very early stages of figuring out what works and what doesn't. And there's a lot of big questions about who gets to decide whether somebody stays or leaves in a place.
You've obviously looked at this very closely. What do you think would work?
Well, it seems like the most cost-effective thing is to buy people out, right? So you can always build another levee or another seawall, but there's always going to be a bigger flood that overtops it. So probably the easiest way is to give people money and support to move somewhere else. The problem is, sometimes people don't want to go, so then you have a really difficult governance question. But when you see the power of nature and how much it sort of confounds expert predictions and engineers, you end up thinking that, probably the best thing is to just give it some space.
Now, with climate change so politicized, especially in the U.S., can there be a meaningful debate about it, in a country that needs to adapt and quickly?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult. I would say so far, no, right? I mean, so adaptation, like spending money to protect against hurricanes and wildfires and things like that, is relatively popular in the United States across party lines, especially in a place like Louisiana, right? It's a red state, but it's suffering from coastal erosion very dramatically. But you can't really call it climate change. And oftentimes it's very difficult to have a difficult conversation, right? An honest conversation about the potential future loss. Mostly people just support recovering and, taking action after the loss has already happened. So I'm not super optimistic, to be honest with you.
Jake Brittle, author of The Great Displacement, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.